This video will be concerned with the market and intervention. So it's looking at the market working on its own, satisfying our wants and allocating scarce resources. Or perhaps the market fails, in which case there needs to be some intervention. The government perhaps may need to intervene to regulate the market so that it works better in our interests. So there is a debate as to whether the market should be left alone, left to its own devices, and it'll ultimately solve our problems. So it works in a sense automatically. There is no human intervention required in the sense of regulating the market itself. Or perhaps alternatively, the market leads to bad results, undesirable outcomes, and requires intervention on the part of the government to intervene to ensure that the market is in our best interests. So there is a debate in economics as to whether the market should be left alone or whether we should have intervention. Clearly, if it is left alone, we have a free market economy. And if there was no government intervention whatever, we would have a very extreme form of capitalism, one in which all goods and services are provided through the state. Education, health, roads, street lighting, everything would be provided through the market. On the other extreme, if the government intervened all the time for every market, we would have socialism. Quite an extreme form of socialism where the government intervenes and output decisions will be made by committees of people, and prices would be set by committees and by regulators and so on. So we have a spectrum ranging from, if you like, pure capitalism to pure socialism. And this runs across the political divide, running from one extreme to the other. And what we want to do in this session is to simply look at some of the arguments that are put forward for and against intervention in the market. So we'll look at the case for what's known as laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means leave it alone, let the market work. So we'll look at the drawbacks of government intervention. So we'll assume that the government exists and that there is a predominantly market system, or let's say a complete market system, complete laissez-faire. So there is a market system, let's say, and the government exists, and we want to see what would be the effects of the government intervening in the market. So we'll make the case for a start for the free market system. Now we have a list of points here. Some are greyed out slightly, but some are emphasized, and the first one emphasized, as you can see, is shortages and surpluses. The market economy is made up from an extremely large number of individual markets. If we think about the economy, there are markets for food, different foodstuffs, for different types of transport, for clothing of all types, for accommodation. It's made up from millions and millions of products and services that we take for granted. They are available in the shops. So it's made up from a very large number of individual items. So the economy produces an amazing number of goods and services. Now, for effective government intervention, the government would have to know where the shortages and surpluses were and the extent of these. So if the government is going to intervene in the economy, the government would have to have an enormous amount of research and up-to-date information as well. They would have to know what goods and services exist. Try to imagine it as the government trying to write down every good and service in the economy. There would be millions and millions and millions of items that need to be recorded. All the different types of foodstuffs, all the different types of clothing, different types of transport, different types of products that are made in the economy. It would be a daunting task. The time and the cost of collecting this information would make it totally impractical for the government to intervene to regulate the economy in this way. The government would need this information if it's going to intervene. It would need to know where to intervene. It would need to know where there are shortages or surpluses. It would need to have all of the information before it can make a decision. But given the number of goods and services in the economy, that is not a realistic prospect. So the governments do not do this. So government intervention on point 1 would fail. Poor information. Well, collecting complete and accurate data that may be processed into good information is both time-consuming and costly. Acquiring the data that needs to be analysed is costly. So the government would have to create quite an enormous department for data collection. And it would have to be resourced, which would be very, very expensive. And the researchers within the department would have to travel to identify companies and markets and products and record what they see. And then have to travel back to the office and get it all processed. But of course, that would only give them a snapshot picture. That would give them the picture at that moment in time. They'd have to do it all again the next day because markets change. So there is a problem about collecting the data. Even if that was possible, then it would have to be processed into information that can be used by the government. And how would the information be processed? What sort of computations would have to be carried out? Who would carry them out? How complex would it be? The amount of data that would have to be processed would make it would make it impossible. Governments, like you and I, as consumers, we suffer from what economists call ignorance. Ignorance is rampant. Ignorance means lack of knowledge. We have lack of knowledge of the markets. On a daily basis, we go to buy products, perhaps go into the shop and to find that they've just sold out. And we understand that. They've sold out. We were late. But we have an expectation that that is a signal to the producer. They've sold out. Produce some more. And the producer who wishes to make a profit will then produce extra amounts, put them back in the shops, so the next time I go there I can purchase the item. So the market works through signalling. When we buy, we are signalling to the producer, we like the product, make more of it. If we don't buy it, we're signalling the producer, we don't like it, you don't need to make this. If you do make it, it won't be sold and you'll lose money. So governments are the same as us in that respect. Governments are purchasers. They purchase a lot. The defence forces are expensive, and the government is a big purchaser of defence items. The government purchases health products and education products and so on. But the government can't see the future like we can't see the future. The government doesn't know what technology is around the corner or what consumer tastes will be in a year or in 10 years' time. So the governments are working with essentially the same information as we have. We're facing the future. And as one famous economist called Friedrich von Hayek once said, the future is unknowable. We can't know the future. So we suffer from ignorance. And of course, the last point here is that data, I should say. Data is always out of date. By the time it's collected, it's out of date. So, to try and collect the data on a whole economy is impossible. So the government is always working with poor information. And because it's working with poor information, it may make poor decisions. And perhaps, therefore, it's best if the government does not intervene. That's the point. Because if the government does intervene with poor information, it can make the situation worse. Bureaucracy and inefficiency. Well, the government is a slow decision maker because it is bureaucratic. So even if the government decides to intervene in the economy, it's going to have discussions and meetings and set up consultative committees and undertake research and analysis and publish proposals and have those discussed in the Parliament, and eventually a decision will be made and some policy may be changed. But it's a very slow procedure. And of course, the economy in which we live is one that's changing rapidly. It's changing by the day. So now we have a decision maker, a big decision maker, the government, operating very slowly, and the economy changing very rapidly. And that's not good. Or perhaps it just reinforces the case that the government should not make decisions in the first place, should not intervene in the first place. Allow the economy to move in the directions in which it's moving. But we'll see arguments against this later. I'm just at the moment outlining points that make it difficult for the government to intervene. But because of its inefficiency, stroke bureaucracy, it's seen as a very inefficient way, or a very dangerous way of intervening, because the information it's using is out of date. As I said, it's working with poor information. It can't know all of the markets. The problem of this plethora of markets that are available within the economy. So, and it's working with a very slow mechanism, the bureaucracy of government. Therefore, the government is not an appropriate way to intervene in the economy. Lack of market incentives. There are different forms of economic systems. The command economy, the mixed economy, and the free market economy. Now I've picked out three here. Some textbooks will itemize more than this, but just for the start, we can imagine no government intervention, the free market economy. That's one extreme. The other extreme, as I said earlier, is all government intervention. The government regulates all markets. In that case, we have, if you like, pure socialism. And then, of course, we have something in between, where the government allows the markets to work, but it tries to regulate the framework within which the markets operate. And we call that a mixed economy. And most economies in the world are mixed. Most economies recognise that there is a place for the government in the provision of some goods and services, but that the free market should work for the rest, because the free market is the most efficient way of doing it. That's the view. The market economy relies on incentives for producers in the form of profits. The reason why we have a private sector, the reason why we have the free market, is because entrepreneurs wish to make a profit. So they're motivated to make the profit. They see opportunities in the market, opportunities to start businesses, profit opportunities. And they start the businesses in the expectation of realizing those profits. The products that the producers make give the consumers satisfaction. In economics, we sometimes call it utility. It gives the consumers satisfaction. The consumers want the products. And if the consumers want the products, they buy them. And the producers will realize profits and will continue to produce. If the consumers don't like the products, they won't buy them, and then the entrepreneurs, the producers, will lose. They will lose their investments. But this does not involve the government. This involves individuals, private individuals, dealing with each other. The problem for the producers is trying to work out what the consumers want. What will they buy? And also, what price to charge them. But of course, if the producers make a good profit, have a really good product and read the situation very accurately and make a good product and therefore make a lot of profit, new entrepreneurs will come in to try and get some of that profit. So there will be competition. And competition will drive down the prices because now the producers are fighting for the limited resources of the consumers. So that will depress the price of the product to the advantage of the consumer. The consumer will now get the product cheaper and there will be more of the product available. So the government is not really equipped to deal with this type of activity. The government should really set the framework. That's the view coming out of this one, and the literature seems to suggest the government's function is to regulate, if need be, the markets, to ensure, for example, that producers are not making unethical products or dangerous products. Perhaps they're selling products which will be injurious to the consumer. Consumers buy the products and the products explode or electrocute them. So the government regulates that the products should be safe. They should also give value for money. They should not be deceptive. They should not pretend to be of good quality when they're not. So the consumers have to have some protection on that one. And we'll talk about this later. So there is a role for the government, but it's just not one to get involved with in a detailed manner, and certainly not on the production side. So the government doesn't have incentives as such. It doesn't have much to do with market incentives. It can tax the companies, of course, and tax the workers, and that may affect incentives, but that's the subject matter of a different video. The government may change policy, or a new or different government may be elected, and for this reason the direction in which the government is moving may change direction. We think of the government as being one homogeneous block of people, but in fact in democracies governments get elected by elections every so often, every so many years, and the governments may, one set of people may be rejected by the voters and another set of people elected, and that may switch around again in the future. So there will be a constant change of direction on how the governments see the market working, and how much they are related to the market. They agree with the market, or they wish to promote this idea of market production. So there's a problem about getting long-run direction when the government becomes heavily involved in the market. The government's change and the change direction, it can actually cause uncertainty for the producers, which may deter the producers from starting business in the first place. If they don't think it's worthwhile, they're not going to do it. The business community want a stable economy. They want a stable environment in which to work. There are so many problems about setting up a business, trying to work out consumer requirements, what the consumers will pay, the quality of the good, the actual production process, research and development, changing technology, all big issues, and more. confronting the producers. They don't want also the government changing policy on a frequent basis and changing the way they see the company or the tax policies or some issue associated with the product or whatever. They want a stable environment. So that's a case against government intervention, the shifts in government policy. Voters' ignorance and unrepresentative government. Well, the government is elected by voters. Not in all countries, but in most countries. But the voters may not understand what's required. Sometimes people vote who have not really kept up to date with current politics or current issues. They just vote because perhaps the vote was voted in a particular way. Or some people may not even vote. They don't know what it's all about, and they don't really care one way or the other. They assume that everything will be okay at the end. The government should be elected, or is elected, by the biggest group of voters. And this means that sometimes politicians try to be popular, to try and get elected. It's not that they have policies that's the best policies. It means they're the most popular policies. People like to think that the government can do lots of things for them. When in fact, of course, the government has got nothing. The government only has the resources that it taxes off its own people. That's what the government lives on. It taxes the people, and then it spends that tax money, that tax receipt. But some people may believe that the government can just magic up some money, produce money from nowhere. And some politicians may cultivate this perception and get elected. But that's not good government. And it's not good for the economic system, because it's unrealistic. It's created unrealistic expectations. The government tries to please the biggest group of voters. If it can identify the biggest group of voters, it'll try to please those people, because that is the way to be elected. But the biggest group of voters may be people who don't understand the issues. The biggest group of voters may not understand politics or economics, may not have studied business and management. Probably have not. Now, this sounds like there's a case here for elitism and meritocracy, that the government should be elected only by people who really know the issues. That's not fair either. There should be voting open to all who qualify under the rules. And the rules should be to involve all people, let's say, over the age of whatever, 18, 16 or 21, or depends whichever country you live in, what the rules are. But the government, in trying to please the biggest group of voters, may argue for, say, redistribution of income or redistribution of wealth within the economy. And if it does that and takes from the entrepreneurs and from business and gives to the poorer sections of the community, which may sound laudable, however, it'll deter the business community from opening businesses. Why should they work hard to have it taken away from them? So there are issues. Now, a lot of what I'm saying, I recognise, could be quite controversial, but just make the points, and then they need to be argued out fully. They need to be discussed openly, and these are good seminar topics, ones that could be discussed for a long time in seminar situations. There's no clear answer, but we can see the issues. Lack of freedom for the individual. Well, in the market economy, individuals have quite a lot of freedom. The market economy is based on individual decisions. We go into shops and we decide how we're going to spend our limited resources, our incomes. And we have got scarce resources, so we have to economize. We have to make decisions which will give us the greatest satisfaction for our limited expenditure. Now, if the government regulates the economy, this will distort our preferences. We'll have to perhaps buy products that we didn't want to buy, or products that are not ideally suitable. But also, the government may influence where companies set up. They stop companies from setting up in one area and make them set up in a different area. That may affect the people who are looking for jobs in the first area. They can't get them because the companies have to go elsewhere. Or they may regulate the employment conditions within the company. And this may be done with good intention. But it may cost so much for the company that the company decides not to set up. The company may take its resources overseas and set up the company elsewhere. So jobs are lost. So we have a problem about the lack of freedom for the individual, the freedom to make choices, what products are produced, how much of the product is produced, under what conditions is it produced, where does the company reside, how does the government influence the policies of the company. So we can see there are many issues associated with government intervention. Now I realize these could be very controversial, but we have to grasp the nettle and try and make some sense out of them and make our own decisions as to which way to move with these. Now the advantages of the free market. Well, for a start, there's automatic adjustments. The market economy adjusts, supply and demand. If there's a shortage, the price will rise because consumers are trying to get the good, they bid up the price. Shortages are an indicator to the producer to produce more. There's no government involved here. This is a signal from the market back to the producer. Produce more of them. There is a shortage. But the producer may also put up the price because people are so keen to get it, the price rises. So the producer can receive more profits. But it's all done automatically. If there's a surplus of the product, then the price will fall. The producers want to get rid of the surplus. They want to sell it off. The only way to sell it off is by cutting the price, to try and drum up interest amongst the consumers to buy the product. So the more will be demanded and the surplus will be eliminated by cutting the price. It's done automatically. There's no government required to do this. This is the market system automatically making the changes that are required. Automatically allocating the resources, allocating the products to different geographic locations and to different outlets, working out what the right price is, making sales, and ultimately the company making profits and continuing in business. And not just making profits, but creating employment within the area, creating a demand for capital goods and for distribution services, and the whole economy becomes much more energized. It's done automatically, no government required. And capitalism is quite a dynamic one. It's constantly changing. It's one where new products can be introduced, and producers are constantly almost experimenting with the market to try and see which products will consumers want and like. So every day new products are introduced into the market. Some of them will go on to be very successful. Some will die. Some will fade away. The consumers didn't like them. Perhaps the consumers tried them once and didn't like it, and it's gone. And new technologies is evolving. New ways of working, new ways of producing. We have globalization. We have very rapid technological change. And the market system is able to accommodate this. So there's no need to collect lots of data and do lots of analysis. The business community does it automatically. They do the computations. They decide where to produce, what to produce, when to produce it, what price, what quality. So it's constantly evolving, and this happens in a sense almost automatically. The individuals in business do it. If they get it wrong, if they get their calculations wrong, they're going to lose a lot. They're taking the risk. So if they lose, we don't feel that sorry for them. If they make a lot of profit, we may get jealous. But they took the risk. There are advantages of competition. Competition is when companies produce essentially the same product, and they're fighting for consumers' limited incomes. They're the scarce resource we all have, money. So as the companies fight for our attention in the marketplace, they may cut the price. So we get the product cheaper. We may get more of the product. Maybe more is available. Some companies will try to outwit other companies by clever marketing tactics and promotional campaigns, and so they will fight out amongst themselves, sometimes in a non-price competitive way. Advertising, marketing, promotions of all types. They're trying to fight for their existence. They're trying to fight for our attention. Sometimes it will be price competition. They will cut the price to try and induce more sales. So the consumers benefit from this. There is a danger, of course, that they compete so much that they don't make any profits themselves, or make very little profit, and they will go out of business. But as they go out of business, there are fewer producers, and the ones who are left may be able to make sufficient profits to continue. So there are advantages of competition. Now, the case for government intervention. Well, ignorance and uncertainty. Ignorance is when we don't know. We don't know what the future is. We all suffer from it. And uncertainty is when we have no idea. We just are confronted with a situation and we're not too sure how it's going to work out. We have no probability figures. We can't say the chances are this is going to happen or that's going to happen. We simply don't know. And complex decisions in the face of evolving technologies, for example. Sometimes the government has to intervene to try and produce more information for the market, to try and engage in research and development in a speedy manner, to try and bring out reports on markets and on what's happening elsewhere, and provide as much data as the government can to assist industry and business to make decisions, and also to assist consumers to make good decisions as well. But the government may make this available. It may intervene to try and ameliorate the problems of ignorance and uncertainty by simply making resources available, or enabling companies to engage in this type of research and allowing them to claim it back in tax relief, something of this nature. The government may also intervene because of consumer protection. Customers are faced with products which are complex, and we don't know how the products work. We don't know how smart phones or smart televisions work. We trust that they work. If the product is not well made, then it could be dangerous even. If we buy those products and they're not well made, or they're dangerous, or whatever, it's not fair to the consumer. The consumer bought the product in good faith, but the consumer is ignorant of the technicalities of the product. And therefore the government intervenes to ensure that the producers honour what they say about the product, that they are open and reliable in terms of the information they provide. We also have uncertainty related to investment. The business community can't know the future. No one can know the future. The government doesn't know the future. So they're making decisions about investment today which will generate profits in perhaps a year's time, or in many years' time. Well, they don't know what the world's going to be like at that time. The world may change significantly. So there is an issue about uncertainty, and the government may intervene to try and help with that decision-making process by allowing the business again to claim it in tax relief, or by making it easy for the business to make decisions about location, or overcoming certain structural issues, perhaps putting in better roadway systems for distribution. It tries to help and encourage the business to make decisions about investment. So the issue of ignorance and uncertainty is one which can attract government intervention, benign intervention, in a sense that it's trying to help customers make good decisions, and it's trying to ensure that there is fairness in the market. It's trying to ensure that the producers are providing adequate information about the product. And when it comes to investment, they're trying to help producers to make the decisions to invest by creating a climate in which the investment is welcomed, and that there are some financial benefits, perhaps allowances for investment in certain areas and under certain circumstances. Public goods is an area that is seen as one suitable for government intervention. When we talk about public goods, we're talking about concepts like non-rivalry, non-excludability as well. Now, this idea of public goods was popularized by Paul Samuelson back in the 1940s. But it was understood by economists before then. But the problem is there are some products that are produced by, say, the government, which we would call public goods, because they're provided by the government. But what Samuelson and what many economists have tried to do is to try to work out what is a pure public good, and then run across a scale all the way to a pure private good. Now, this is the subject matter of a separate video, but nonetheless, let's deal with some of the issues here. So according to the ideas associated with public goods, is that the first point related to public goods is the consumers should not be rivals for the good. So, for example, street lighting. Now, that's provided by the government, perhaps local government or some agency of the government, or by the government itself. So, street lighting. Now, with street lighting, we're not really rivals for the services of the streetlights. We don't go out every night to celebrate streetlights, to stand under the streetlights and enjoy the streetlights. We accept that there are streetlights. So we're not rivals for the streetlights. If we all went out, there would still be enough room, I suspect, on the roads for us all to stand around admiring the streetlights. Now, this is a rather silly example, but it illustrates we're not rivals. So streetlights have this non-rivalry attribute, which is one of the desirable attributes for a public good. Now, how about non-excludability? Can we exclude people from receiving the benefits of streetlights? Well, yes, we could. We could have a curfew issued by the government that no one is allowed out of their homes after dark. In which case the streetlights would be on and no one would see the streetlights. So we could have non-excludability. We could have excludability, I should say. But for it to be a public good, it should be non-excludable. Take the Defence Force as an example. Are we rivals for the services of the Defence Forces? No. The Defence Forces exist. Everyone in the country is being protected. Everyone is being protected. It doesn't matter what the scale of the Defence Forces are. It might be just one man and a dog, or it could be hundreds and thousands of tanks and aeroplanes and so on, missiles and so on. The fact is, we're not rivals. We all get protected by whatever the provision is. The non-excludability part, well, can we exclude people from receiving the benefits of the Defence Forces? Very difficult, because once it's in existence, we all get it, and it's very difficult to exclude us. We can't tell if another country is going to attack us. We can't tell them everyone in the country is protected by our Defence Forces except Mr. Smith. He's not protected. So we can't do that. It's not feasible. So we have non-rivalry and non-excludability. So we could say the Defence Forces is a public good. By the way, non-excludability in the case of the Defence Forces, also non-rejection. You can't reject the Defence Forces. If you happen to be a pacifist or someone who doesn't like the Defence Forces, you're still being protected by them, whether you like it or not. You're still receiving the benefit. To you it may not be a benefit, but you're still receiving that service. Now take education. Is education a public good? Well, are the children rivals for the services of education? Children who go to school, let's say. Yes, they are. The more children there are in a class, the poorer the service they will receive. If a class has 20 students, each one will receive a good service from the teacher. If the class has 60 students, each student will receive less attention. So they are rivals. Can we exclude children from school? Yes, we can. We can just have a rule and stop some children from going to school. It doesn't seem very fair, but it could happen. We can conceive of that happening, that there is a rule that some child or some children don't go to school. I mean, it's unimaginable almost, but we could have it. So we can exclude, and there is rivalry. So is education a public good? Well, from what I just said, it doesn't sound like a public good. It sounds like a private good. But it's a private good that's publicly provided. Now, with public goods, they have to be financed. And if we allow the population to voluntarily contribute towards the provision of public goods, then we may have misrepresentation of preferences. By this I mean some people would say, yes, we want schools and we want children to receive an excellent education, and yes, I will pay voluntarily for it. No taxation, I will pay for this. And everyone in the country could say the same thing. but they don't actually pay. They become what's known as free riders. They benefit from the public goods. They benefit from having an educated population, a more compassionate population, a more productive population. But they don't want to pay. So to get over the problem of what's known as the free rider problem, we have coercive taxation. The government imposes a tax on us and then forces us to pay the tax and then spends the revenue from the tax on providing education. Now this means that a lot of products and services that are made available through the government are not necessarily public goods. They are different types of goods, which we will call merit goods, ones that we feel that the government should provide through the taxation system, as opposed to public goods. Public goods have this very strict set of rules, non-rivalry and non-excludability. So most goods will fail on this. Some will get through and be genuine public goods which have to be provided by the government. The case for government intervention, well, immobility of factors and time lags. Sometimes there is training and retraining required within the population. It takes time. It takes time to retrain the population. If a structural company, a large company working in the primary sector or in some major manufacturing company in a particular region, or some big employer, if some big employer closes down, the workers have the skills suitable for that employer, but then those set of skills are no longer required, so the population have to be retrained. So the government would have to try and provide skills training for the population so they can find other employment, because their skills are no longer required. Now this has happened in the UK. In many parts of the UK, coal miners in some parts of the country, they had skills as coal miners, but when the coal mines closed, they have to be retrained. They have to go into other occupations, and retraining has to be made available to help those people to find productive employment. There are many examples like this. So that's the case, one of the cases for government intervention. It's another case where it could be argued that the government needs to try and have a more balanced regional development. In the case of the UK, London dominates the UK. It's like a big magnet pulling industry and people down into London. So London gets bigger and more complex and more sophisticated. The rest of the country loses talented workers, talented population, loses businesses. They're all being, in a sense, sucked down into London. So the government in the UK tries to create this idea of growth poles, to try to create a growth pole in other parts of the country. The government in the UK sometimes talks about the northern powerhouse, to try and get other cities to grow rapidly, to try and balance out what's happening in the context of London, so that instead of companies being sucked down to London, they will go to Birmingham or Manchester or Leeds or some other city. So it may need government intervention to do this, and the government may want to increase or improve transport networks between the various cities and communications channels and so on. And also there's an issue about the market takes time to make adjustments, and sometimes the market itself can be very slow in making these adjustments. That there may be a need for, in the example I just gave earlier, there may be a need for retraining. Well, the market may not be suitable to provide that, or the people who need the retraining can't afford to pay for the retraining. So it's argued that the government should intervene and also speed up the process to try and make the adjustments faster. Protecting people's interests. Well, the government should intervene to protect people's interests. For example, employment laws. If there are no employment laws, then the employers may not work very ethically. Workers may work under poor working conditions, poor health and safety regulations, or may not treat the workers fairly or honestly. So over a period of time, laws have been enacted which are seen as quite enlightened laws which will help the workers to develop and enable them to work safely within the workplace. There's also, of course, consumer protection. As I mentioned earlier, products are sophisticated, and some are very complicated, and it's only fair that the producers make adequate information in language that's understood, non-technical language, made available to the users so they're able to use the appliances properly and benefit from the use of the appliances. But it could also be the case with foodstuffs. Sometimes when we buy food, producers may have added different ingredients, and it's important that we know what's in the foodstuff, and it's important that the producers do not add substances which are injurious to our long-term health. Merit goods I mentioned briefly earlier in the context of education. I said sometimes the government may be confronted by products, or the need for products, which are not public goods, but which we just think should be provided. We believe that education is a good thing. And we'll see later when we talk about externalities and in other videos that there are quite good economic arguments for the government providing services like education. But it's simply the hallmark of a good society that we have an educated population who understand politics, understand technology, who can read and write, and who can live out a purposeful life. And to do that, the government provide certain goods. For example, some health care, education, perhaps travel facilities. It depends on how far it goes. Sometimes governments perhaps provide lots of goods and services. But bearing in mind, all of these have to be paid for out of taxation. So that the people who are working and pay tax, they're the ones who are ultimately paying for these products. Now, to correct externalities. Well, an externality, for a start, is a non-traded interdependence. It's sometimes we have interdependencies between us. They're not traded. There's no economic situation. There's no market, or there's no money involved. We are interdependent, the way we live. So if you live next door to a company and the company is polluting the atmosphere, you have to inhale that. So you are interdependent with the company, but it's non-traded. The company doesn't compensate you for this. So your health is being damaged by the company. The company is polluting the atmosphere, let's say. And you are inhaling the bad air, this polluted air. So that's an externality. It's a non-traded interdependence, and it's felt to be unfair. So governments intervene to try and rectify this, to stop the pollution, to stop the congestion. If the company is blocking up the roads and making it difficult for other people to travel or to function properly in whatever context. It could be the company is producing a lot of noise, so local residents can't sleep. But it could be also not non-traded interdependence could be you're living next to a very noisy neighbour who plays loud music all night and you can't sleep. It's a non-traded interdependence. So we need government intervention. We need laws, regulations to try and bring this into line, to try and end this inequity. There can also be positive externalities. Sometimes people will engage in activities which benefit everyone, and yet we don't compensate them. So children going to school, back to schools again, children going to schools go, receive an education, become better people as a consequence. They become more productive. They're a better class of people in the sense that they're more compassionate, more understanding, more polite. So we live in a better society because of education. And therefore, we should contribute towards education. So there is an argument for public provision of education based on this positive externality. So externalities can be negative, as the case of pollution, congestion and so on, but they can be positive. We can have positive paybacks. We should perhaps pay for some health provision, because if there's an epidemic in the country and we're all threatened by some horrible epidemic, we like to think there's some central agency who are going to come to our rescue. So we pay into it. That's what I meant by merit goods earlier on, the previous point. To protect property rights. Well, the government records property rights. The most basic property right we've got is our own lives, our own body. So we've got a property right over ourselves. And therefore, it should not be abused by anyone else. No one should attack you or hurt you. You have a right to enjoy life and to make the most of your life. So the government should protect your life, and if someone hurts you, there should be legal proceedings to stop that person hurting you. If someone is killed by someone else, murdered by someone else, the government, through the legal system, should step in and that person be prosecuted. Now I say this in the context of our lives, our basic property right over our lives, but of course there is a contradiction here. Sometimes governments in different countries will have conscription. They'll force people to join the army or join the navy or whatever, join the armed forces, and of course thereby putting their lives at risk. So there's a contradiction in what I've just said. It's one worth thinking about. But moving away from our lives as the basic one, we have lots of property rights. We own different things. We own the clothes we wear. I presume we own the clothes we wear. We bought these clothes and we have a right to use them. Some of you will have laptops and smartphones and so on, and those are yours. Hopefully you haven't stolen them from somebody or attacked somebody and taken them away from them. You will have bought these items. They are your items. You have a property right. They are yours. And if someone takes it from you, that's illegal. That's wrong. If someone takes it from you, they have possession of your property right, but it's still yours. They may have it, they may have possession of it, but it's still yours. If they take it away from you by force, it's still your item. But if they contract with you and say, we like your phone, we will give you so much money for it, and you say, okay, and you sell it to them, then the property right of the phone changes hands. It goes to the other person and the money goes to you. And again, we have a regulatory framework for that. We call it contract. There's been a sale of an item and a contract between the people that the property right would switch hands and money would switch hands the other way. So the government records the property rights. It doesn't record all property rights. the government may not know that you own a laptop or own a desktop or own a phone or whatever you've got, because these items are too small. But it may know that you own a house or own some land or own a car. These are bigger items, so these tend to be recorded. And the government protect your ownership of those property items. So the government intervenes to protect property rights. It also intervenes to regulate monopoly power. Monopoly is a single seller of a good or service. There's no competition when there's monopoly. It's just one seller of the price of the product. So the price tends to be high, and there tends to be reduced output compared to more competitive markets. So with monopoly, one seller, higher price, reduced output, generally speaking. So consumers are disadvantaged. Consumers have to pay a lot for the product, and there's only a limited amount available. Also limited choice. The producer, the monopolist, tends to make abnormal profits, make very high profits, profits over and above that necessary to keep the monopolist in the market. The monopolist is making excessive profits. But of course, the monopolist may use some of those profits to pay for research and development expenditure, which is very expensive and very risky. Or it may spend a lot of the profits on innovations and introducing new products, or improving the working conditions, or improving production, making more investments. So there could be a payback to the rest of us from companies making abnormal profits. There could also be greater job security. People working for the monopolist won't be threatened by redundancies because the company is not doing too well. Having said that, it's possible to be a monopolist and selling a product that consumers don't particularly like that much, which means the monopolist is really unfortunate. The monopolist is the single seller of a product, but it's not one that's really necessary or desirable in terms of consumer preferences. So the consumers are not really that interested in the product. In which case, the monopolist is really not a very traditional type of monopolist as put forward in the textbooks. Generally speaking, when we think of monopolists, we think of very powerful organizations making lots of abnormal profit and so on. But governments intervene to try and regulate monopolies, to try and stop the monopolies from restricting the output, making sure consumers can get enough of it, and make sure that the prices are not being exorbitant, and trying to get the monopolists to behave in a way that consumers benefit from the product and don't have to pay perhaps excessive prices. Now, let's move to macroeconomics and talk about intervention on a macro scale. Up to now, we're really talking about microeconomics and individual markets and products and so on. So let's look at the macro economic points. And we'll start with this idea of rules versus discretion. And we'll see what that means in a second. So we'll deal with macroeconomic points now. We're going to say there are two sets of economists. There are in fact many sets of economists. There are Marxist economists and laissez-faire economists and free market economists and interventionist economists, and there are all sorts of economists, all groupings, institutional economists. There's a long list. People categorize themselves in all sorts of ways. But we'll just take two examples. One set called the monetarists, that there are classes on the course on monetarism, so that's why I mentioned monetarist. And there's a second class called Keynesians, and there are classes on Keynesian economics available also. So we'll just focus in on these two types. The monetarists tend to be very market orientated and believe strongly in the market. The Keynesians think that the market system is essentially good but it does need some direction. It needs government intervention to make sure that the outputs are desirable and timely. So the Keynesians think government intervention is required. Monetarists think that the market should really be left to its own devices. So the monetarists are against discretionary intervention. They think the government should not just decide to intervene. They should leave it to market forces. So they're against discretion, against discretionary intervention. So they don't want the government just to be able to intervene when it considers it correct to do so. And the reason why is because there are time lags. The economy is constantly going into boom periods and slump periods on its own. We call this the business cycle. The economy, if the government doesn't do anything, the economy of its own volition will move into a slump period and back into a boom period. That's the business cycle. Again, subject matter for a separate video. But the reasons why it goes into slump is because as customers buy less of a product for some reason, whatever reason, other companies become quite depressed, will cut back, will make some workers perhaps redundant, or perhaps make some workers onto part-time. So there's less income in the economy. Other producers will start to sell less as a consequence. They will start to wind back, and a slump can develop. But at some stage, when the slump is really deep, if companies are going to continue in existence, they're going to have to invest. And they're going to have to invest in more materials, raw materials, more machines and so on, because they need to stay in the market. So they'll place orders for these, and of course the people who supply these will take on extra workers to meet this increased demand. Extra workers, more money in the economy, more money floating around, more products will be demanded, and the economy will lift itself out of the slump and into a boom period. In the boom period, there will be a lot of inflation, prices are rising very rapidly, market signals get mixed up, and generally it goes back into a slump period. As I said, it's the subject matter of a separate video. But if the time lags are wrong, if the government intervenes at the wrong time, they can make the situation a lot worse. If the government thinks the economy is going into heavy recession, a lot of people out of work, a lot of deprivation and poverty arising in the community, the government needs to do something. So the government decides to put money into the economy by expanding road production or spend more money on the defence forces, trying to put more money into the economy, more spending power into the economy. But what the government doesn't know is the economy is about to rise on its own. It's about to get better on its own. So by intervening at the wrong time, they're adding to the upward pressure, which can cause the boom period to be excessive. There can be very high rates of inflation and great complications in the economy in terms of imports and so on, which means the government has to step in to try and put the brakes on, take out some of the money it was putting in, increase taxes. But of course, it could be that the economy is about to turn down on its own anyway. So if the natural downward pressure on the economy is about to happen, about to come into effect, and the government also adds some depressing policies to augment the downward pressure, this will cause a major slump. So time lags are an issue. The government also doesn't know how much intervention it needs to make. So the monetarists think the government shouldn't intervene in the economy anyway, because they don't know. They suffer from ignorance, as I said earlier. We don't know how much intervention to make. So it might make the wrong amount, which will cause the situation to be worse. So they could overcorrect. The government may ignore long-term consequences. Sometimes the government will perhaps intervene in the economy and put more resources into the economy, more money into the economy, and more expenditure through fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is government regulating its own expenditure and regulating taxes. So the government may intervene, put a lot more money into the economy through fiscal policy, but that may cause rampant inflation perhaps at some future time, or it may create distortions in the market, that some companies are no longer required because the more state-favoured companies have taken over. So there are also big issues about the long-term consequences of the government intervening, because the government, like us, it doesn't know. It doesn't know the market effectively. It doesn't know the future and what's going to happen. The monitors prefer rules. So the government should publish a rule and say next year it will increase government expenditure by 2%. That's a rule. They've said 2%. Now this means the market can start to adjust to this. They know what the government's going to do. So they can now, it'll influence how the private sector will start to function. It knows what the government's going to do. The government has said what its policies are. And that could help to reduce inflationary expectations. But it can also influence the general way in which business operates, because they know with certainty what the government's going to do. It's a rule. So the government should create a stable environment for investment and growth. They should say what they're going to do in terms of investment, what they're going to do in terms of their policy towards growth, towards taxation, towards capital allowances for businesses who are setting up, and so on. And it should be done and posted for several years, so there is certainty within the business community. They know what the government is planning and what the government's doing. This other group of economists, the Keynesians, these are more interventionist. They believe that the market system can fail in terms of employment, can lead to unemployment, and it's felt that by the Keynesians that unemployment is the big evil, and therefore the government should intervene to try and promote employment in the economy. So they're against rules. They think it can cause severe fluctuations in interest rates and can cause greater instability. When the government commits to a rule, the government doesn't know what the future is going to be. There could be a lot of changes in the world economy over the next couple of years. So it could lead to instability. The government may need to change its direction, according to the Keynesians. So the government needs flexibility to be able to deal with, let's say, changes in unemployment or changes in the rate of economic growth. Of course, the monetarists would say, well, those changes are short-term, and those changes can be disastrous because of the impacts in terms of the business cycle and booms and slumps and so on. The Keynesians also want to know which rule to choose. I mean, let the money supply grow by a certain percentage, or cut taxation by a certain percentage, or which rule exactly, and why? What's the logic behind it? So the Keynesians want, as far as possible, for everything to be explained, and the mechanism, how it's going to work, to be explained. Rules may conflict. It may be the case that on the one hand the government wishes to cut taxes, so it cuts taxation to give people more incentive to work, but if there is not sufficient capacity in the economy to grow jobs, to make more jobs available, then it's simply giving resources to the workers who were quite happily working before at the old rates of taxes. So it has to make sure that there's the policy is going to be successful. If it gives more incentive to business, then it has to have some sort of indication that the business will work on that, and more businesses will come into existence, or existing businesses will grow. So this should be based on some sort of evidence. Rules may become unsuitable over time. It all depends on the pace of the economy, and the technology. Decision making is much faster now with the advent of computers and very smart pieces of software. So it may be that rules can be tweaked or amended to become more suitable in the light of different trends within the global economy. And also, world leaders are constantly negotiating changes through the World Trade Organization and through trading blocks as to how we trade internationally. And if one country is applying rules irrespective of what's happening around it, in the environment around it, those rules may become unsuitable. The Keynesian case for discretion. Well, fine-tuning can be improved by faster forecasting and quick-acting policies. The Keynesians believe in fine-tuning. They believe that the government have got a lot of ways in which it can intervene. It can change direct taxes, indirect taxes, government expenditure. It can change allowances for investment. It can change expenditure in the armed forces and public health and so on. So the government has got many different outlets to implement fiscal policy. And the fiscal policy, they think, can be fine-tuned. The government can intervene from time to time and just make small adjustments. Of course, the case against this is the one we said earlier, that the government may not have the information available to make those adjustments. So the Keynesians may have a problem about trying to justify fine-tuning in the face of ignorance on the part of the government. But it was certainly the case that it was felt in the early days of Keynesianism, and Keynesianism was developed by John Maynard Keynes in 1936 in his famous textbook, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, and was really adopted by the world economy after the Second World War in 1945. Lasted as a full-scale economic policy right throughout the capitalist world until the mid-70s. It's difficult to put a date on it, but it fell away in popularity, and monetarism took over in the 1970s. The effectiveness of fiscal policy. Well, fiscal policy, as I said, is just government expenditure and taxation. Well, for a start, some items of government expenditure and taxation will be determined automatically without the government. The economy will enter into boom periods and slump periods on its own. This is the business cycle. The economy simply goes through a boom period or a slump period when left to its own devices. The economy is constantly having ups and downs. So if the government doesn't do anything, the economy will still have the ups and downs. So if the government sets a certain tax rate and a certain expenditure rate at some level of taxation, and the economy then enters into a boom period, so more people find work, there will be more expenditure, there will be more people working, more income tax. So the government's tax revenue will increase. And also, there will be less people on welfare benefits as the economy enters a boom period. So government expenditure will be less. So taxation will have gone up and government expenditure is less. This will mean that the government is taking out of the economy, taking resources out of the economy and tending to bring the economy back to where it was before. This is called an automatic stabilizer. So we have to look at the surpluses and deficits on the government account, on the fiscal account, to see what is happening. If the government's putting more into the economy than it's taking out, it's stimulating the economy. It's putting more in. It's causing the economy to be stimulated. If it's taking more out, then it's contracting the economy. It's making the economy smaller. And what we find is that as the economy goes through a boom period or a slump period, these automatic stabilizers tend to pull the economy back to where it was originally. There could be adverse supply side effects. This is the problem of fiscal drag. Well, if the government, let's say, has a certain tax rate, it could, let's say, increase the tax rate because it wants to spend more on welfare programs. If it increases the tax rate, there will be a disincentive effect. The supply side of the economy may be less efficient, or it may be reduced. There might be less people who want to work because there's more tax. Less businesses want to open. So the government must look at the supply side of the economy when regulating its fiscal policy. And also, of course, with fiscal drag, as I said earlier, as the economy enters a boom period, more is taken out of the economy because more people are paying tax and less people are receiving welfare. So the government's taking more out. This idea of fiscal drag, the economy is being pulled back to where it was originally, being dragged back to where it was originally. That will have supply side effects. It means that the government's taking more out. There's less available for business. There's less available in terms of employment potential in the economy. So adverse supply side effects. Now, discretionary policy. Well, problems of forecasting the magnitude of the effect. And that's the problem. When the government intervenes under the Keynesian system and, let's say, puts more government expenditure in, let's say it borrows the money and puts more expenditure into the economy, then it needs to forecast the magnitude of the effect. And that's very difficult. And there's a lot of literature on topics like the multiplier effect, which is not often mentioned nowadays, but still relevant. The multiplier effect may complicate what the final outcome will be. Now, I'm not going to discuss the multiplier effect here, but just note it and perhaps look it up yourself. But it does appear in other videos. The effects on other injections and withdrawals and crowding out. Sometimes if the government increases its expenditure, for example, the government will take resources that would have been used by the private sector. So the private business sector find it difficult to get those resources, get those workers, or get the equipment, or get the finance, because the government's taking it. If the government's increasing its expenditure, the private sector will ultimately have to pay for it through taxation. But the government is also crowding out the investment that would have taken place by the private sector, because the government is now spending more. It's taking key workers. It's employing more people, employing more resources. These resources perhaps would have gone to the private sector. Would have been invested in the private sector. So what's happened is the whole structure of the economy has changed. Now the public sector is growing in importance and the private sector is diminishing. So there is a crowding out effect. As I said, I'm not going to talk about the accelerator effects and the multiplier effects specifically in this video, but these are relevant, and you should look up the meaning, particularly of the multiplier, and check out the videos where that's discussed. The problem of timing and lags, as I said earlier in the context of this, it's difficult for the government to know what the timings are, or the lags. When is the right time to intervene? When is it dangerous to intervene? Because the economy is already, let's say, coming back into a boom period, but the government doesn't know that. But the underlying forces are towards the economy picking up. Now, if the government intervenes at that moment, it'll simply exacerbate the upward movement in the economy, leading to inflation, a lot of imports and so on, causing a major downturn in the future. So there's a problem with discretionary policy of when to intervene, and the Keynesians must try and deal with that one as well. So this is a long video, and that's the last point I'm going to make. We've seen the differences between monetarist and Keynesians in overview in this one in terms of intervention. We've talked about micro-intervention in markets and why governments would want to intervene in individual markets. So it's been a long video with many points. It's well worth having many breaks during this video and revisiting many times and making copious notes to make sure you understand all of the issues that are discussed here. But that's all we're going to deal with in this session, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.